Hello, everybody. Welcome to UC San Diego and the Japan Forum webinar series at jfit, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. We are at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy, where we offer degrees in a variety of matters, including a Master's of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you are interested in this, in our degree programs, please look at gps.ucsd.edu. And likewise, you can learn more about our Japan activities at UC San Diego and especially at GPS by going to jfit.ucsd.edu. Our weekly webinar series is a fairly new affair, although we have done 8 or so up to now, and you can see past and upcoming events also on our JFIT website. Let me just alert you to a few upcoming ones. Next week, we are going to talk about culture, which is a dicey topic in Japan studies, but it is coming back thanks to Michelle Gelfand, who is the creator of the Tight Loose Culture Framework. That will be followed by a conversation with Peter Gurevich on corporate governance. We will then move to energy, the post-Fukushima, post-COVID dilemmas. And on the occasion of the Tokyo Olympics that are not starting on July 14th, we will have a webinar on what the postponement of the Olympics actually means. As you can see, there's more and more. I won't bother you with all of this. You don't have to remember it. Just go to our website and sign up. Today, I have a topic that is actually of great interest to me personally, mostly because I know so little about it, and that is religion in Japan. And there's something about religion in Japan that I always thought was a little different. In all my time living there, no Shinto priest has ever come to visit my door and ask me to turn into a Shintoist. I don't even know whether that's a word. There seems something different about religion in Japan. There are many, and they are maybe not the place to go to for solace in times of crisis. Also, the religions themselves may be in times of crisis, like they are in many places in the world. So to figure out how this all works in Japan, I have asked 2 of the most prominent next generation religion scholars on Japan in the world with me today. That's Ulrike Baffelli from Manchester. She's burning the midnight oil. Thank you, Ulrike. And Levy Mclaughlin, who is at the North Carolina State University. Let me stop sharing as I go to my introductions. Yes. Ulrike is a senior lecturer in Japanese studies at the University of Manchester. She earned her PhD in Italy, in Venice, and has held positions at Hosei University and the University of Otago in New Zealand. She's an expert in Japanese Buddhism as well as new religions, and has written about Japan's new religions, reactions to uncertainty, religion and gender. She's an expert on Om Shinrikyo, which we will talk about in a moment. And her most recent book is a 2016 book, Media and New Religions in Japan. I hope I got that right. Levy Mclaughlin is Associate Professor of Asian Religions at North Carolina State. He earned his PhD in Princeton and has studied at the University of Tokyo and the University of Toronto. In a former life, he was a concerto pianist with a degree from the Royal Conservative of Music. I really need to have you play the piano sometime. He has a new book, 2019, titled Soka Gakkai's Human Revolution. And he also has several very interesting papers on religion and politics. We'll probably today talk about the Komeito and the religious party that is tied to the Soka Gakkai. And he has a number of very interesting papers on salvage and salvation and tsunami and the religion in 2011 was a big time of crisis. So without further ado, let me hand the microphone over to our guests before we then have a conversation. So I've invited both of them to speak 10 minutes. And then we'll open up the Q&A, and I invite the audience to type your questions into the Q&A field. So even though usually it's ladies first, we've decided to have Levy go first because he'll give us a little bit of a primer, sort of, Japanese religion 101. And then we'll hear from Ulrike. So Levy, why don't you start us out? You want to share your PowerPoints maybe.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for zooming in from all over the world. It's lovely to see you. We're talking about religion in times of crisis. I do feel that before we dive into the specifics of Japan and religion in crisis, that we address the ongoing crisis that is sweeping through the cities that we are all zooming in from. I'm speaking, of course, about Black Lives Matter and about the thousands of people who are protesting on the streets against the police murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and other men, women, and transgender people. I know that many people who are signed on right now have also been signatories to a petition that I had the honor of co-authoring along with 3 other people. Michelle Wong from Georgetown University got the ball rolling, and Jillian Thomas from University of Pennsylvania, and Kimmy Sanders, who's a PhD candidate at Harvard, contributed in putting forward concrete measures that we urge the Association for Asian Studies to undertake to address the endemic racism in our field. It may seem sometimes that Asia is distant from anti-Black racism. It is not. It is also a framework that has been perpetuated by the scholarship that we've all been engaged with. And so we put forward demands that the association undertake concrete steps to foster the next generation of Black Asia scholars, and also to come to terms and to start addressing the injustices that persist in our field and also in the areas we study. A few hours ago, the AAS actually issued a long list of commitments that it's going to make from now on. That will be publicized, I'm sure, quite widely. It is obviously inspired in part by our petition, but they've also gone further, and they're also going to look at things like addressing the pipeline issues and getting a broader range of scholars from the K-12 range upwards as well. So I urge all of us to pay attention to this and to hold them to their words, to turn them into actions. I say this not because it's just, I'm not standing on a soapbox. I say this because it's actually absolutely integral to the topic that we're going to be talking about today. The study of religion has always been integral to the concern for ethics, concern for injustice, concern for the socially marginal. And so I'm going to take up a few of those topics as I look at what it means to talk about religion in Japan. Give me a sec to figure out the share screen thing here. Here we go. So let's start with some of the conceptual dilemmas when we talk about the category of religion. There's a common expression in Japan. People talk about being born Shinto and how they die Buddhist. And so 2015, for example, those are the latest stats from the Agency for Cultural Affairs, which falls under the Ministry of Education. Every year they gather the statistics from denominations that fall under the rubric of religious juridical persons. They have to give membership numbers in order to keep their tax-free status. And so you don't have to be a math major to figure out that these percentages exceed 100%. So that the number of people who claim to be Shinto parishioners are 89.5 million, or 74.4% of the population. 69.8% of the population is Buddhist. Christianity, that's actually probably exaggerated, 1.5%. It's probably less than 1% of the population of Japan is actively Christian. And then you have other. And the other is a category that includes things like new religious movements, that is to say groups that are founded in the last 2 centuries, folk traditions, and a bunch of other things. And so these traditions, this categorization of traditions has a significant impact on how people think about religion and on their lives because they're legal categories as well. Let's consider a few other things. There are conceptual dilemmas that persist when people survey religious attitudes. And there's been a series of large-scale surveys that include questions about religions over the last decade or so. In 2008, the Yomiuri Shimbun, which is the largest newspaper in Japan in terms of readership, it's actually the largest readership of any newspaper in the world, had a large-scale public value survey, and they asked the question, very loaded question, do you have religious faith? And as you can see, it's a really stark number. It's a very small number, right? 26.1% of people in Japan claim to have religious faith. Similar numbers appear in other large-scale surveys. You'll see, for example, the World Values Survey, which is a big international thing. Japan ranked lowest in the world in terms of respondents who trust religious organizations. It's lower than the People's Republic of China, which is overseen by the officially atheist Communist Party, for example. It's quite striking. In 2013, the Japanese National Character Survey, only 72% of people said they had no religious faith. Similar numbers in the 2015 survey by the Japanese General Social Survey. The Wynne Gallup poll is quite striking because they gave the option of atheist to respondents, and a full 31% of people chose atheist. Atheism isn't really a thing in Japan, but it's striking to see that about a third of the respondents going for the option that positions them the furthest away from religion as possible. But then you have this really intriguing newly published series of stats from NHK. So every 5 years, the NHK Broadcasting Culture Research Institute has the end value here is 5,400. So 5,400 respondents came back with numbers including responses to religion, and they differ from the other, in some respects, from the other surveys. So 47% said they believed in either the Buddhas or the kami, which are the deities associated with Shinto, or the sort of native traditions of Japan in some cases. 32% claim non-belief, only 32% in this survey. 71% performed some kind of ritual, visiting graves of family, and only 12% of the respondents said they didn't do anything religious. So how do we account for this really weird mishmash of seemingly incommensurate numbers? Well, there's numbers of reasons why this is the case. Let me see if I can advance this. One important reason is historical. The rather confounding fact that the category religion in Japan is not itself a native category. And it is the product, you can characterize it as a category born of crisis, born specifically of political crisis. And so shukyo, the word that is now commonly used in Japanese for religion, is a translation of the English word religion. And this was a process that took about a generation to coalesce around a single category. And it was started with the arrival of the Americans, forcing open Japanese ports, requiring new trade agreements, and therefore it's a legal category heavily informed by the imperialism of the time, by the norms, the white supremacist norms I'm going to emphasize here, of what it meant to belong to the world as a legitimate power. And so as Japan rapidly transforms into an expansionist imperialist nation state on its own, shukyo, or religion, becomes a component of that transformation. And I'm going to provide the slides I know there's always people who say they want the slides and stuff, so I can maybe give them to you, Ulrike, to provide, but they provide a transcription of one section of the Harris Treaty of 1858, the first commercial treaty, which includes a whole section on religion, and it's all about territory. And I think that's very telling. And this is actually one of the most important places where religion had to be translated into Japanese. And so along with this came a bunch of presuppositions which persist really, really tenaciously to the present day about what religion is supposed to include. So imported religion presuppositions include things like you should go to a regular worship service of some sort. You should be knowledgeable about scripture. You should know what your religion teaches. You should have some connection to a priesthood or some sort of ordained clergy. There is also this primacy of faith. Faith, as you can see in the questions that were asked in the surveys, right? They start off with faith, this notion of an interiorized realm within the individual that is sacrosanct and protected by constitutional rights and things like that. And also there's a sort of presupposition of exclusive adherence, like you belong to a religion and you can somehow represent it. Very few traditions in Japan hold up to these standards. And so you have this weird irony where traditions that have existed in some cases for something like 20 centuries in Japan are suddenly subject to this umbrella category and these presuppositions that don't fit it at all. And this makes people very leery, very unwilling to self-identify as religious, unless they are forced to by virtue of the type of adherence that they have, right? Another thing that's missing from presuppositions about religion, missing in Japanese religious articulations, is a category called theodicy. So if you can come away from this webinar with a new vocabulary word, this is great. Theodicy is a lovely term, and it basically means concern for explanations of evil. Why do bad things happen to good people? And so what's striking, especially in watershed crisis moments, is a comparative absence of concern on the part of religious professionals and hardcore adherents with those kinds of questions. In other words, there are very few obvious, explicit discussions of why is this happening, these appeal to the divine. And instead you see religious activists doing very pragmatic things. So for example, there's a photo here in the aftermath of the 3/11 disasters in Northeast Japan, the aftermath of the tsunami. And so that was one place where instead of a lot of theodicy talk, which is actually you saw from secular officials like the governor of Tokyo and people at that time, instead the religious people were doing things like providing chemical toilets, opening up temples and shrines and churches as refugee centers and things like that. Okay, one more thing. Religion remains a stigmatized category as a result of this. And so what happens is you have all kinds of workarounds for it. Instead of using words for religion, people turn to things like tradition, culture. Culture is coming up next in your webinar. This is going to be a loaded term as well, right? So for example, people could say, oh, don't worry, I'm not religious, as they are carrying out, for example, a Buddhist ritual, because this falls into the category of tradition or culture. Therefore, it's considered to be safe, legitimate, orthodox, and not scary. There's also, this creates a hardened divide between the so-called new religious groups and traditional groups. Another thing that's really come up since especially 1995, and I know that Erica is going to be speaking about the Om Shinrikyo incident and things like that. There's been a rise in interest in what's called spirituality. And in Japanese, it's telling that the term in Japanese is spirituality. It's the direct use of the English. And so this distances people once again from all of those associations with previous scary religious kinds of concepts. One of the ironies or the paradoxes that persists, therefore, is the seemingly disproportionate influence of religious organizations on electoral politics in Japan. I'm going to end with that point because it highlights the dilemmas that people face every day. The ruling coalition in Japan consists of two parties, the majority party, the LDP, or the Liberal Democratic Party, and its minority, the junior partner, Komeito, which was founded by the so-called new religion Soka Gakkai. And it retains strong alliances with Soka Gakkai and relies on Gakkai voters to gather votes and basically keep the coalition in power. The LDP, on the other hand, has strong connections to religions and what Julian Thomas smartly calls religion-adjacent organizations that aren't necessarily like labeled as religions, but have strong ties. They tend to be highly nationalist, associated with Shinto and related groups. And these organizations exert quite a lot of impact on policy formation, on vote gathering, and related activities. And so in other words, religion cannot be ignored. It's an extremely important aspect of life in Japan today. I'll end with that and pass things to Erica.
Thank you, Levy. Can you leave your PowerPoints maybe? Before we turn to Erica, we have one question from the audience that is a clarification question.
Sure.
And it refers to the word you used, legal category. I think you talk about the cohesion sort of thing, like a tax exempt category or something, but could you just say one more thing on what legal category as a religion means?
There's multiple sides to this. So for one thing, to be qualified as a religion officially in Japan, you have to register as what's called a shukyo hojin, or a religious juridical person, which grants tax exemption from religious activities and a number of other things as well. This has taken some heat over the last few decades as religious groups have, in some cases, grown extremely powerful. The other side of it is that the 1947 Constitution guarantees a strict division between religion and government, and this is guaranteed in Articles 20 and 89 of the 1947 Constitution. And so this too is seen as sometimes as a dilemma, particularly, frankly, in times of crisis, when religious groups activate their memberships to carry out all kinds of different activities. This is sometimes seen as an abrogation of that divide. And religions have to tread a very careful line in some cases to offer aid, to not violate the constitutional divides there. So lots of complications associated with that.
Great, thank you. So let's turn to Erica, since you just said crisis, that's good. Let's turn to Erica. And Erica in Manchester, thank you again for joining us. If you want to share your PowerPoints for your...
Yes.
Okay, let's see them. There they are. Excellent.
And so good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. Thank you for logging in. You might hear the rain in the background, so you believe I'm actually in Manchester. It comes with the city. And so before I start, I also wanted to thank Michelle, Kimberly, Jolyon, and Levy for initiated that initiative with the AAS, the petition. And also, of course, it's now important that all of us will work because those commitments became action in our work. And I just going to use my 10 minutes to talk a little bit more of what religion actually do in time of crisis. And I'm going to pick up in particularly on issues of social and economic inequalities and what happened, particularly in that domain in this moment. But before doing that, I think it's important to point out that the idea of being in time of crisis is not something new. In the context of Japanese religion, there's been this idea that religion has been associated with the idea of chronic state of crisis for decades. And this has been picked up also by international media, as you can see with some title in some journal and magazine in the last few years. And this idea of is connected also with wider issue of depopulation or decline of interest in religion, but the idea of losing membership or people not really paying interest in, on temple closing down, etc. But at the same time, we have seen in the recent past, as Levy has just mentioned, example of how religion reacted to particular crises, especially when it's come to natural disaster. And 3/11, that tribal disaster in Tohoku in 2011 was one of the major example of the role of religion in contributing to the reconstruction and acting during the disaster. So maybe instead of looking at is religion really in crisis or not, is interesting to look at how the state of crisis is perceived and what is done, but also what is done in the term of the vision for the post-corona time, for the post-disaster, which is something that, so is this crisis a transition towards something new, not necessarily better? We all know by now, in a future that still look very uncertain for different reason. And so what are the possible vision that these groups and organizations could offer or are thinking about? And the other important element, I think, is the idea that what is different from the previous example of we have a reaction to crisis with the corona crisis. And there are two important differences that I just want to point out. And the first one is the fact that the virus is everywhere. It's not geographically located in a specific area, but is everywhere in the country and around the world. And the second aspect is that restriction that has been imposed to control the spread of the virus has made it impossible to gather, to perform ritual, to attend festival, but and even more important, to mobilize people and volunteer. So, and in the previous example that we had in Tohoku, for example, that disaster relief activities, as Levi was saying, imply a huge activities by a large number of people. They were not just collecting donation, but it was actually going there and being active on the ground. So the inability, so that this impacted in the organization in terms of their activities, so the impossibility of gathering. So that religion is a very social activities, and gathering together and doing things together is very important. So some organizations were able to move some of their activities online. But it's also quite important to point out that this is not necessarily common. Not all the groups have the literacy to do that, but also some of the membership are not able and don't actually use the internet as much as we could imagine, or the social networking. So what some of the organizations have pointed out is important to keep the connection in different way, also because some of the members are in the high risk category of elderly people. But one of the other issues, so the social distancing and dishuku, so the self-restraint, as I mentioned before, resulted in the interruption of volunteer activities. And quite completely for at least the first couple of months, but even now they are still quite limited. And this is important because volunteer resources are one of the main resources in a lot of the organization. Also in terms of the activity in the organization, as we saw again in the case of the Tohoku in 2011, but also in terms of what they do outside the organization. And this is can particularly crucial when the fact that the group cannot mobilize their volunteer at the moment, come in a point where there are also certain new issues emergency in the wider context. And this impact, when we look at the activity by some organization that works on the ground. And so we have group like Christian faith-based organization or Buddhist organization that work in particularly deprived area in larger city in Japan. And these activity are filling the gap in a sense, or supplement the welfare provision by the government. So they are quite crucial in this area and work in particular with people in the street. Or people they are disconnected with their family, single parents household, etc. So the reduction of volunteer due to the COVID-19 crisis has coincided also with an increase of number of people in need. And this has been pointed out in several media reports as well, the increase of number of people asking for benefits, but also the houses crisis for some people, and the lose of job, especially temporary job, etc. So those organizations has now to deal with less resources. Internally, they have less volunteer, and at the same time, an increase of number of people that need their support. So I've asked some comment of one of these organizations that I met last year for a project I'm conducting with Toyo University on minority and marginalities and religion in Japan. And this organization is called Ito Saji no Kai, and operates, it started in 2009, and it's run by Buddhist priests and volunteer in the area of Asakusa, Ueno in Tokyo. And they provide food, advice, medicine to people on the street. And I noticed that between April and beginning of June, the number of people in Ueno station and Ueno Park has raised from around 60 to 100. And a lot of these were, some of them, they don't know exactly, but some were people that used to sleep in the manga kissa. So this establishment, this cafe where people can read manga and surf the internet. And a lot of them have 24-hour package. They are cheaper than staying in a hotel. And those were closed during the emergency state. So those people ended up in the street, but also there is also people that lost their job, and they were in temporary job employment. And so there's with this increase of number. So they are continuing their activities, but with limited resources, but they have increased in their visit every week instead of every 2 weeks. And one of the questions I asked was about the future, what is their perspective? And in a sense, they think that there will be more need of psychological support and counseling in the long term, and on top of the material. And this is something that we have seen in the case of the Tohoku, for example, as well. So the long-term impact, but also they say that the lack also of volunteer and resource might be an opportunity for this organization to connect more with others operating in the area. So that can open up opportunity in that sense as well. The other organization I was looking at is that works more with children in need. Otera Oyatsu Club was also pointed out that there is an increase on mental and economic burden on single parents household, that often are single mother household, because due to the crisis and often that the lack of job, of the loss of job. So I think what is, I just wanted to point out in general, just to conclude, and so we have time for questions, is that that when we talk about crisis in religion, it's important to see that it is integrated in the wider issues in the society. And if the situation is sharpening some of the issue already existing inside the organization in terms of elderly membership and etc., is also exposing social and economic inequalities in the wider context where some of this group operates, and the two has to be looked together also in terms of what can happen from now on. And I think I stop here so we have time for question and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me see that I can stop this for you. Yes, excellent. So thank you. That was terrific. And we have questions coming in, and I'm going to begin with one of mine. So Levy, you started out by saying that ethics are an important part of religion, and thinking about society and what's the right and what's wrong. And I've always been puzzled by the fact that there is no book of Shinto, right? There's no, so we just use Christianity because I happen to know most about that, but there are a variety of religions where there's a book and a sort of a set of behavioral prescriptions. Thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not do that, and the other thing, right? And so that then becomes a sort of a framework for a set of social behaviors. The Japanese situation has always struck me as being much more flexible. And, there are some basic things: be kind, be respectful, be, honor the family lineage and so forth. But I'm not aware of this is a right behavior and this is a wrong behavior set of prescriptions that come out of, say, Shinto or even Buddhism. Is that right? And if that's so, where do those prescriptions come from?
These are very big questions.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, they're great, and they're ones that we have to be ready to talk about. It raises big questions about religion in general. I mean, are ethics and behavioral norms located necessarily in religion in every case? This is one of the prevailing questions for religious studies, and it often comes up against a lot of critique, actually. Must you necessarily be religious to be ethical? And many would say no. And so Japan actually serves as a really wonderful counterintuitive place to look at for where ethics come from. There's wonderful work done, for example, by Janine Sawada, who is at Brown University, who works on this idea of tsuzoku dotoku, or common morality, which is a topic that was taken up by Robert Bellah and others, and I would also really recommend the work by Takashi Miura, who's just published a book as well from the University of Arizona. So these are folks who are looking at that, basically around that question: how can we locate where people learn how to behave and live together in Japan? This gets back to what I was speaking about earlier, the dilemmas that accompany this imposition of this religion label onto a whole lot of traditions that previously did not have to live under that kind of rubric. So right now, you could say that the way things have shaken out due to a great deal of historical and political development is that Shinto, there's a certain division of labor that ends up sort of dictating which religions do what, right? And so for the most part, yes, would you approach a Shinto shrine for deep existential questions about your existence or how best to behave? The instinct would be to say no, because largely the responsibility of Shinto is ritual behavior for purification, for the seeking good results for very pragmatic concerns, things like passing entrance exams or good health and things like that. Whereas those deep-seated existential worries would be more suited to a Buddhist framework, because Buddhism is very much a teaching associated with where did we come from and where are we going, and how should we act in order to achieve a meritorious rebirth. But the truth is that in practice, it gets much more complicated. And this past year, I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time with Shinto priests. Actually, I'm writing a new book on religious dimensions of Japanese politics, which means I spend a lot of time with politically engaged people of all sorts, including Shinto folks. And they tell me stories about how their parishioners do indeed come to them with all kinds of existential dilemmas. And they actually receive great solace and great ability to overcome personal difficulties through ritual. So difficult to parse, and certainly it's not easy to say, go to this, in a utilitarian way, go to this tradition for X, right? But this is also a dilemma that affects, say, Christians in America or Jewish or Muslim practitioners as well, right?
So I want to go to Om, but I just got a question in that ties into this. So let me stay with Levy for just a moment. Robbie wants to know, if there's no theodicy, so why do bad things happen to good people, sort of thinking, then what? So people are not asking this question, or I mean, is it just, why did the earthquake happen or the tsunami happen in Fukushima? Is that not a question that's being asked, or is there a different way of answering it?
It's a really good question, really important one. Erica and I have gone back and forth on this too. It is important to point out that there have been some glaring exceptions to the absence of theodicy things. So for example, some prominent new religious movements, Happy Science or Kofuku no Kagaku made a name for itself around 311 by actually taking out ad space, blaming the then Democratic Party of Japan government for the earthquake and tsunami and nuclear meltdown, for example. There are examples of that, but they're rare. So I would add two things. One is that theodicy definitely is there, but how does it play out and who's saying it and who's doing what? It's sort of intriguingly, you see that kind of question being raised by representatives, like scholars of religion actually raised it around the 311 time, and politicians, I think, because it was an effective way to sort of rile up people's sentiments and essentially cast blame on people they didn't like. But the truth is that this is where Buddhism and the teachings really start to matter. So if this is one of the things, I actually asked this question of a true Pure Land Buddhist priest whose temple was destroyed by the tsunami and who was overseeing a really devastated part of Sendai, right on the coast. I asked him about that. So you have these resources available to you in your teachings to talk about things like karmic causality. You could potentially say that this is the result of people's improper actions. And he just shook his head and said, that is completely missing the point. And so we don't know what is going to happen when we plant these karmic seeds. Is it going to result in a tsunami in our lifetime? Is it going to result in something terrible or something great happening in the infinitesimal future? The only responsibility we have to turn to now is our actions now. And so therefore, pragmatism is itself a very profound theological response. And so we have to think more broadly about what theodicy includes.
That's fascinating. Let's turn to Om. So Om Shinrikyo, you will remember, it was this sect. And in 1995, they launched a sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway, the Hibiya-sen in Kazumi-Maseki or wherever it was. And fundamentally, it was a domestic terrorist attack. And it shocked Japan because, well, first of all, there was a domestic terrorist attack. That was shocking. And then it was done by something called a religion. And who were these people? And what was their problem? And what did they want? And so we want to hear about that in terms of the largest concept of what religion means, or maybe also the stigma associated with it. But John also wants to know whether Om is still alive and well, and whether they're using COVID and the current crisis for a reuptake of their activities, which would be a very sort of weird thing to happen, I guess. Erica, you want to take that first?
Okay, I'll start with your first part. So the role of Om in the image of religion in Japan. And of course, the impact was massive, as you mentioned, as it was a shocking event, also because the sarin gas attack was not the only violent action perpetrated by the organization. So after that, several other crimes were discovered, and then the leader and other member imprisoned. And as you probably, a lot of you remember, the leader and 12 members were executed in 2018. The image of religion, as Levy has mentioned, has always been, problematic, but after the sarin gas attack, it became the kind of idea that religion can also be dangerous, can also be violent. So the negative image of religion actually increased quite sharply after 1995, and the repercussion was long lasting for definitely that generation, but also afterwards. And generally all the organization had to respond to it. The new religion, of course, had to immediately try to show and portray themselves as different, as not dangerous. But if you talk also with Buddhist organization or other organization, they often refer back to 1995 as a very damaging event for the images of religion in general. But what is also interesting for me was that the event was also seen as a paradigmatic of a crisis of an entire society, and in particular the crisis of the young generation. So a lot of, there was, the fact that some of our members, definitely not all of them, but came from some elite university in Japan, or had good jobs, and they left everything to enter this, very unusual in a sense, but it's very demanding practice and extreme ascetic training, was seen as a kind of a crisis of what's going on, a crisis on value and a crisis of the society. My point is often that if you look at the number, it wasn't actually. So was a relatively small group comparing to some of the major new religion organizations. So if you compare to some of the big ones that claim, or at least had millions of members, a much higher number, that the people living in commune was around 1,000. So in a sense was actually the reverse, was the fact that a lot of Japanese youth were not attracted by so much of extreme practice, in a sense. So it can also be seen in that way. What's happening now at the moment, there are two main splinter group. Well, one is not really a splinter group, is Aleph, is the new name that took in 1999 and is still operating. So the group can still operate, but they cannot register legally as a religion organization. The other is a splinter group that was formed in 2007 as this called Hikari no Wa. There are big discussion about how the size of this group, Hikari no Wa, is very small, and mainly operate to they stream the talk of the leader, that is Joyu Fumihiro. They used to be the spokesperson of and they also organize, of course, some training and some meeting in their facility. Aleph seems to be larger, but they contest the number that the Kwancho Sacho, the Public Security Intelligence Agency, publish every year, because they say that the people who are leaving the organization are not counted. So they only count who join but not who leave. So there is a contestation. I wouldn't say that they are particularly lively in a sense of in terms of numbers, but they are still definitely active, and they organize mainly a lot of yoga training and classes. So I guess in this, for what I could gather, a lot of those activities were suspended in this period for the obvious reason, as all the other organization. And one thing that is quite important to point out, that a lot of this new religion organizations stopped their activity quite early on in February, earlier than some of the more established kind of oldest organization. And one of the reasons is because they they didn't want to become one of the cluster, to tell the truth. The fact that they were really concerned about public images in the case that the virus will spread their facilities. So definitely this is something they are taking into consideration. If the COVID-19 crisis will become an occasion for new proselytism or some of this group is probably still early to see. But I think the fact that the limitation in meeting and interaction is definitely a limitation for the religion organization in general, because it's usually how they tend to interact. But this is just, speculation, because we actually don't know yet.
So that's interesting, right? Because normally, time of crisis is good for groups that attract people that look for structure. Whether that's on the one end it could be the mafia, and on the other end it could be a cult, a new religion, an old religion. One question we have is about Devin wants to know whether the role of celebrities to sway over the hearts of the young is actually stronger than the religion, or Robbie is phrasing the same question a little differently. He wants to know what the draw is. I mean, do we know who is drawn into whether that's the own splinter groups or the more established new religions? I mean, are there some studies on wanting or need, or is this people that are lonely going to the manga cafe rather than the temple? Can you share a little bit on the
I hope Erica will start with this. She'll be modest about this, but Erica is the world's leading authority on Om Shinto and is very close to.
We could do that, and then I'll come back to you, Levy, in a moment, because I have a big question for you.
Okay.
Well, it's an interesting question, but it's been asked in several other contexts. If that, so this is regarding the celebrities, right? If a celebrity or other type of mediated practice has substituted the role that the religion used to have. And so this is not just in Japan, but it's a question that has been circulated a lot in the religious studies. And this is, I think, then we go back on how you define religion then. And so what are you find it as a kind of definition to look at this practice, and what you define in a way or in the other. What is probably been seen from 1995 in Japan is that declaring that you are part of a specific religion organization is not necessarily something that most people do feel comfortable in doing, and they may hide that, or they might but it doesn't necessarily mean that people don't practice. They might not join a specific organization, but they still might do other type of ritual or other type of practice, etc. So it doesn't necessarily, the two don't exclude the other. But this is definitely something that I don't have a definite response to, if those kind of celebrity or mediated practice has replaced a certain role. I don't know, Levi, you have anything to add on this?
Not immediately, apart from the fact that this does play into some of the, I was just reading these new stats that NHK has published. They do sort of cohere with these kinds of concerns, because they break down the responses by generation. So the cohorts that they look at are the ages 16 to 29, 30 to 59, and 60 and above. And it's really intriguing to see where the youth are going. And there's this really strong interest among young people in the power of talismans, in this phenomenon in Japanese called ano-yo, which I wish we had in English, sort of like that world over there. It sort of includes everything from the spirit world to the afterlife to just aliens even. I mean, it could be anything, right? So there's this so the same people who will really strong, in some cases very strongly profess that they are not religious, will have a very non-metaphorical understanding of the existence of a spirit world, that these are real. And I think there too, we can't separate, say, love and sort of enthusiasm for celebrities, for example, or for music or for fandom of some sort, with the spirit, the spiritual, that these things are actually coherent with one another. And so that there is some really fascinating research being done on that, combining fandom with looking at religion. And you see this being done by, for example, Horie Norichika at University of Tokyo. He's actually cited in the NH case study, for example.
So the big question I have that's been like the 800-pound elephant, whatever, is politics. Shall we talk politics then? You've written a book about the Komeito. You are hanging with some of those people for your field research. So how do we want to wrap our head around the Komeito, and how does it affect policymaking? So is there a real decision-making sort of push by them, and how do we even think about them?
We can start with a concrete example. It's very directly linked to COVID-19. So, for example, there was the stimulus payout, which is now going through really, really slow process in Japan, a very frustrating one for many, many people who've applied for it. Initially, this was going to be the equivalent of $3,000 paid out to a select number of recipients, decided by the LDP, largely, employees of mid to large corporations and cronies of various sorts and things like that. Komeito pushed back so hard on this issue that they actually threatened to leave the coalition unless the LDP changed its policy. And so beholden is the LDP to Komeito's vote gathering power that they had to cave in. And so what you have is a result of Komeito demands, which is the equivalent of about 1,000 US for every resident in Japan, not just citizens. That's the ideal. How it's actually playing out in reality seems to be something of an open question. But that reflects the territory that Komeito has carved out for itself, which is basically social welfare policies are our bailiwick, and the LDP had better step off. And the reason for that is because of the founding and the development of the party over the last half century. It was founded as a pacifist party with a very, very strong progressive series of policy initiatives. And it still focuses largely on its main constituency, which is homemakers, women who raise families. Is that religious? Well, it turns out these women are also the engine under Soka Gakkai as well. And so if you go to a Gakkai meeting, any meeting, but especially if you go to one during the week, during the day, on a weekday, it will be 80 to 100% women. And so that's actually the truth of all of the organizations we could speak of. We need to talk about gender really seriously. We need to talk about the gender divide and the really stark difference between the face of the organizations that you'll see at the top levels, leadership levels, and who's actually doing the real work. And it's very strongly women who are running the show. And so that'll play out in a lot of important ways in terms of policymaking, right? So that's where you see the LDP ceding a lot of territory, for example, to Komeito on things like keeping a comparatively low taxation rate on consumption items, making sure that there's payouts to families with small children, seeking to reduce or eliminate the tuition costs for school up to high school, things like that. Those are Komeito initiatives, actually, which are then sometimes claimed by the coalition.
Well, are they more of a socialist party then?
Well, this is where it starts to get difficult to pigeonhole, because then when you turn, for example, to security, things start to look quite different, right? So, for example, in 2015, the Komeito signed on with 11 new laws were called the Ampel Holse, or this is security legislation, which reinterpreted Article 9. The LDP says it's not a reinterpretation, it is a reinterpretation of Article 9. So to allow for collective self-defense, which basically completely overturns their founding pacifism of the party, but also of the religion. And so this is seen a sort of disaggregation of the Gakkai membership into different political groups. And we're going to see really big changes in Japanese politics because of religion. And the big issue is going to be what happens when the leader of Soka Gakkai, Ikeda Daisaku, dies. And so where will people's loyalties go? Will they continue to electioneer on behalf of Komeito and the LDP? Will they shift to the LDP in some cases? Because there actually are some members who would be quite happy with the status quo and are themselves quite hawkish or right-leaning. Others are staunchly opposed to that, and others have started to think of political alternatives, to the extent where you, for example, see people running for Reiwa Shinsengumi, the new left-leaning minority party, who are running against, who are Gakkai, the Gakkai member running against the head of the head of Komeito in the same district. Things like that are starting to happen. So all of this really does boil down to religious commitments. And so we can't take that as a factor, for example, in a data set. You have to take these teachings on their own terms. You have to really think of these things seriously from the point of view of the people who practice them. And that's why I studied religion. That's why we do this stuff.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. I'm sure we could talk for another hour on this. I do have a question that is a little bit forward-looking. Simona and others are asking, what is the post-COVID? What's if you had a crystal ball and you look into the future? Are these religions, whether they're new religions or the old temples, innovative? And I've always thought of them as very innovative and very pragmatic. So the word pragmatism has come up. So are they actually, can we expect them to be very innovative around structuring something new with this pandemic, right? So, I don't know, online something, or new social welfare activities in particular. This would, we have to recover from this, this will take a while, the economic shock, if not the medical shock. So what do you think the role of religion is going to be going forward? I mean, what do you see in terms of outlook? Erica, I think this might be directed to you. So why don't we start with you?
Okay. So I think first, just to point out that I saw it came up in some of the question as well. And new religion is a quite contested term, a problematic term, in the sense that some of this group are 200 years old. So whatever we should call still new and whatever still innovative is also open to discussion, in the sense that maybe they were at the beginning, much less now. They operate very similar to other organizations. What will happen, and the post-COVID is a very interesting discussion, because it's something very new. I think that, as I said before, religion has, well, historically, no, there's been other pandemics, but in the recent past, it's quite different than other crises in the term of how long this is going to last, what kind of consequences it is, and what kind of the new normal or the new lifestyle we are going to live. So how a group are going to look into that. But economic, financial issue are going to be an important issue for all the religion organization, both in terms, of course, of their organization and how to deal with that, but also this kind of the social and economic inequality that are becoming very visible, and how they are going to respond to it. So one of the possibilities that we saw mentioned is this idea of further collaboration between some of these organizations. And of course, the question is also, will be very interesting for us as scholars to see who is collaborating with whom, in the sense that there is also different, and this is something we saw in the case of Tohoku as well, where this collaboration was working better between some organizations, with other were not seen necessarily as appropriate partner, again, for public images, etc. So this will be quite interesting. The other very important aspect, I think, that we need to look more careful is also the role of minority religion in this case. So that's the reason I put the image of the mosque at the beginning of my slide, which is that Kami Center in Yoyogi Mehara, where they was also, introducing now all sorts of measures for social distancing in their practice. And there is a group of very active young Muslim that works, that I met in that mosque, that are also quite active in presenting the images of Muslim in a different way, Islam in a different way in Japan. So those also are quite interesting to see, in my opinion, what kind of activity they are going to promote. what's going to happen, I think, is something all of us will like to know also for our personal life, and not just for our research. So it's an open question mark, but it can be something quite interesting coming up. Yeah.
So we always have this problem on this show when it gets really interesting. Time is up. And it so happens that time is up. So if you want to know from Levy what he thinks the future will bring, then by all means, we should get in contact with you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I want to just show my goodbye screen, so to say. Let me just go forward. So next week, everybody, we continue kind of along these kind of path. We're talking about culture, and culture being defined as the social norms of behavior. And I'll have Michelle Gelfand, who has greatly influenced my new book with her framework of tight and loose cultures, Japan being a tight place, and how that has also affected the COVID-19 responses in Japan. So if that's of interest, please join us next week this time. And let me end with a round of applause for Levy and Erica. Thank you very much. And this is terrific work. And I look forward to continuing this discussion with you.